All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works. We're taking something complex, breaking it down, and pulling out those key insights just for you. We're focusing on efficiency here so you can walk away feeling like you really get it.
That's right. We want to help you become fluent in these ideas quickly so you can actually use them.
And today's subject is a big one. We're diving into Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. This book, seriously, it's like a landmark. Doctors, people in finance, policymakers, so many fields have been changed by his work on how we make decisions.
It's incredibly influential.
And for us in this deep dive, well, our goal is to give you the core ideas about how our minds work. Not just the theory, though. We want this to be practical. How do you actually see your own thinking? Maybe even improve it. So let's get started.
Well, you might think it's system 2, but hold on. System 1, that's your fast one. It's intuitive, goes with your gut, often emotional. And the thing is, it's running all the time, automatically, without you even realizing it most of the time.
Okay, so it's like those instant reactions we have. Kahneman gives some great examples of this, like understanding a sentence without effort, or if a loud noise suddenly happens, you turn your head, bam, just like that.
Exactly. No conscious thought involved. Now, system 2, that's the slower one. More deliberate, logical, the one that needs your focus. Imagine you're doing some tough math, like 23 times 78. You can't just do that instantly, right?
Right. Got to put some effort into that one.
Or picture trying to have a conversation in a super noisy place. You have to really concentrate, block everything else out. That's system 2 working hard.
He even mentions an experiment where if you ask someone to do a math problem while they're walking, almost always they'll stop. Like they literally can't do both at the same time.
Exactly. It shows you system 2 has limits. It can only handle so much at once. And it makes sense because we tend to think of ourselves as this conscious reasoning system 2.
Yeah, like that's who we are, right?
But here's the twist. While we identify with system 2, a lot of our choices, our judgments, they're actually heavily influenced by system 1. It's kind of running in the background, feeding us all these impressions and feelings that then shape our beliefs and the choices we think system 2 is making. Kahneman calls it the secret author of many of our decisions.
Wow, so the secret author, huh? So how do we know all this?
Well, a lot of Kahneman's early work, and he did a lot of this with Amos Tversky, it focused on these predictable errors we make. They called them biases, and they come from the mental shortcuts our brains use, the heuristics.
Okay, so biases, these are like systematic ways we get things wrong.
Yeah.
And heuristics, those are the shortcuts.
So what are some examples? A classic example is the availability heuristic. And a key takeaway here is that the loudest voice or most visible example isn't always the most likely. We need to be careful not to judge the world just by what's easiest to remember.
Okay, unpack that a bit. What's the availability heuristic all about?
Basically, it means we judge how common or likely something is based on how easily we can think of examples. But this can be totally skewed by things like media coverage.
I see. So if something's been all over the news, even if statistically it's not that common, we might think it's more likely to happen to us just because we remember all those examples easily.
Precisely. Kahneman uses the example of Michael Jackson's death. It was everywhere, dominated the news for weeks. So even though statistically dying from something like that is pretty rare, in that moment it felt huge because it was so available in our minds. Meanwhile, other important things, maybe affecting way more people, don't get that much coverage and seem less important, even if they're a much bigger deal statistically.
It's like the media primes us to remember certain events, makes them more available, even if they aren't typical. I remember Kahneman had this funny moment in the book where he's trying to think of examples of underreported events, and he realizes he's actually mentioning those pretty often, too.
Right, it's easy to fall into that trap. And we should mention, when Kahneman and Tversky first started focusing on these biases, some people criticized their work. They felt like it painted too negative a picture of how we think.
Well, yeah, who wants to be told they're making mistakes all the time?
True. But even though their work has evolved over time and there are some alternative explanations for certain findings, the main idea that our minds are susceptible to these systematic errors, it's pretty widely accepted now. Their research really changed the way we think about human behavior.
So we've talked about biases, these potential pitfalls of System 1. But intuition isn't always a bad thing, right? Kahneman later recognized that not all intuitive judgments are wrong.
Absolutely. They realized that expert intuition in certain situations can be incredibly accurate. But this isn't the same as a quick heuristic judgment. This comes from a lot of practice, like years of experience, developing a deep ability to recognize patterns.
Ah, like an experienced doctor who can just tell what's wrong with a patient even before all the tests are done.
Exactly. Kahneman talks about Herbert Simon's work with chess masters. They've played so much that they see the board in a completely different way. Simon said, intuition is nothing more and nothing less than recognition. So the expert, whether it's chess or medicine, they see a situation and recognize a pattern based on their huge experience, and that gives them the answer. It's not magic, it's pattern recognition that's been built up over years of focused practice. And this is totally different from a quick heuristic judgment.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have these two systems. In system two, the slow, deliberate one, it sounds like it can only do so much at once. Kahneman gets into the idea of mental effort, right?
He does, and it's fascinating. He and his colleagues did these experiments where they actually measured mental effort by looking at people's pupils. They gave people tasks, some easy, some hard. Like one was called add one, where you had to mentally add one to each digit in a sequence. Another was add three, which was way tougher.
And their pupils, they got bigger or smaller depending on how hard they were thinking. That's wild.
Yeah. They found that the pupils would change size every second, matching the changes in how hard they were thinking, longer sequences, bigger dilations. And that add three task, it was so demanding that people's pupils would dilate, like 50% bigger in those first few seconds. Their heart rates went up too. It was like the limit of how hard they could work. If you push them any further, they just give up. And what's interesting, if you gave them more digits than they could even hold in their working memory, their pupils would actually stop getting bigger, even shrink a bit. It's like their brain said, nope, can't handle this anymore.
Wow, that's a literal picture of mental effort. It really shows that system two has limits. You can't just keep thinking super hard forever.
Absolutely. And usually we can walk and think at the same time, no problem. But when you push system two to its limit, things that normally feel automatic, they start competing for those limited resources. That experiment you mentioned before, the math problem while walking, that shows this perfectly. Really difficult mental tasks, they require stillness, focus.
So this ties into the idea of ego depletion, right? Like mental fatigue. Can you explain that?
Yeah, ego depletion, it was explored by Roy Baumeister and others. It's the idea that any kind of effort that takes willpower, thinking hard, controlling your emotions, even physical exertion, they all draw from the same pool of mental energy.
It's like a muscle that gets tired.
Exactly. So their experiments showed that if you exert willpower on one task, you'll have less willpower left for the next one, even if it's totally different.
Like that experiment where people had to hold back their emotions while watching a movie, and then later they couldn't do a physical task for as long.
Exactly. Holding back their emotions drained some of that mental energy, so they had less left for the physical task.
Okay, so now there's this idea of a lazy system too. It seems weird, right? Because system two is supposed to be the one that does the hard thinking.
It is a bit strange, but it's true. System 2, even though it can reason carefully, it tends to, well, slack off a bit. Often it just goes along with whatever answer System 1 comes up with without really checking if it's right.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Try this logical puzzle. All roses are flowers. Some flowers fade quickly, therefore some roses fade quickly. Most people hear that and think, yeah, it makes sense. But if you look closely, it's actually not logically sound. Just because some flowers fade quickly doesn't mean those are the same flowers that are roses.
Ah, I see. So it sounds right, but it's not.
Right. And to catch that mistake, you have to really think about it, and most people don't bother. Lazy System 2 just accepts the easy answer.
It's like our brains take the path of least resistance. And that's where the cognitive reflection test comes in, right? That bat and ball problem is a great example.
Exactly. A bat and a ball cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? What pops into your head?
10 cents.
That's what most people say, but it's wrong. Think about it. If the ball cost 10 cents, the bat would have to cost $1.10, and that adds up to $1.20.
Oh, yeah. So what's the right answer?
The ball cost 5 cents. It takes that extra moment of thinking to get it right. And studies using this test show that people who get it wrong tend to be more impulsive. They want immediate gratification. It fits with this idea of System 1 being impulsive and System 2 being capable, but often lazy.
Okay, I'm starting to see how these two systems work together. Now, what about priming? That's always seemed kind of spooky to me, how we can be influenced without even realizing it.
It is pretty amazing. Priming is the idea that subtle cues in our environment, stuff we don't even notice consciously, can affect our thoughts, feelings, and even our actions.
Like that experiment with the students and words related to being old.
Exactly. John Barg and his colleagues, they had students unscramble words to make sentences. Some students got words related to old age, like Florida, forgetful, gray. And then, after doing this, those students actually walked down the hallway slower than the students who had neutral words.
No way. Just from those words.
Yep. They weren't thinking about being old consciously, but it still affected their behavior.
It really shows you how much is going on in our minds that we're not aware of. Okay, let's talk about cognitive ease and cognitive strain. These seem to be important for how we process information and make judgments.
They are. Cognitive ease, that's the feeling you get when things are easy to process. Like if something is familiar or written clearly, or it fits with what you already believe, that creates a feeling of ease. And that ease can actually make us more likely to believe something, even if it's not true.
So if it's easy to read, we're more likely to think it's true.
Yeah. System 2, being lazy, often goes along with that feeling of ease. But Kahneman says that if we're really motivated to be accurate, we can sometimes override that. Now, cognitive strain, that's the opposite. It's when things are hard to process. That tends to activate System 2, make us think more carefully. Like a font that's hard to read, it can actually make you pay more attention to what's being said.
So making things a bit harder to process can make us more analytical.
Interesting. And they did experiments with this too, right? Those word triads, the coherent and incoherent ones.
Yes, those experiments showed that when people felt cognitive ease, they were more likely to judge the words as related, even when the researchers tried to separate that good feeling from the task itself. It really showed that this feeling of ease linked to coherence, it underlies a lot of our judgments.
Okay, got it. Now, what about norm theory? I feel like this is about how we decide what's normal or unusual. You're right. Norm theory, developed by Kahneman and Dale Miller, it explores how one unusual event can change our perception of what's normal in that situation. Imagine you're in a restaurant and someone takes a bite of soup and makes a face like it's awful.
Oh, I've seen that happen.
So then other little negative things might seem more, well, normal, like if another customer is rude to the waiter or someone else complains about their food.
Yeah, it's like that first bad thing sets a new standard and everything else is measured against that.
Exactly. It's like that first reaction is stored in our memory and then other similar things seem less surprising.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about the halo effect and WYSIAD. Two more big ideas that really shape how we judge things. Let's start with the halo effect.
The halo effect, it's our tendency to let a general impression of something, a person, a company, whatever, affect how we judge specific things about them. So, if we have a good overall feeling, we're likely to rate them higher on other things, even if those things aren't related.
Ah, so it's like if we think someone is smart, we might also assume they're trustworthy, even if we have no reason to think that.
Exactly. Kahneman uses these examples of Alan and Ben to show this. If you describe Alan as intelligent and hardworking, his stubbornness might seem like a good thing, like he stands up for what he believes in. But if you describe Ben as envious and stubborn and then also say he's intelligent, that intelligence might make him seem more dangerous, like he could use it to manipulate people. It's the same trait, intelligence, but it's seen differently depending on the overall impression.
The halo changes how we see everything else. And WYSIAD, what does that stand for again?
What you see is all there is.
Right, WYSIAD. And this is about...
It's a core part of how System 1 works.
Yeah.
WYSIAD means we base our judgments on the information we have right now. We often don't consider what might be missing. System 1 is great at making a story from the available data, but it doesn't naturally account for what it doesn't see.
So we can be overconfident because we think we have the whole picture, but we might be missing important information.
Exactly. And this contributes to framing effects, too. That's where how something is presented, the frame, changes our emotional response and our choices. And it also leads to base rate neglect, like that example of Steve the librarian. The vivid description makes us ignore the fact that there are way more farmers than librarians. What we see in that moment becomes our whole reality.
Got it. Now let's talk about how System 1 handles averages versus sums. It sounds like there's a difference there.
There is. System 1, it represents categories by prototypes, like the typical example. So it's good at understanding averages, what's typical, but it has trouble with sums, the total amount of something.
Like if we see a bunch of lines of different lengths, we might be able to guess the average length pretty well, but to get the total length of all the lines added together, That takes more work.
Right. System 1 doesn't have a quick way to calculate sums. And this means that when we're judging something based on a total, we often overlook the size of the category, how many things are actually in it.
Okay, interesting. Now, Kahneman talks about this mental shotgun and substitution. What are those all about?
The mental shotgun is how System 1 works. When you ask it a question, it automatically generates answers to a bunch of related questions, even if they're not exactly what you asked. And then substitution happens when lazy System 2 just takes one of those related answers and goes with it, without checking if it really answers the original question.
So it's like we answer a different, easier question without even realizing it.
Exactly.
Can you give an example?
Try this. Some roads are snakes. Some jobs are snakes, and some jobs are jails. All of those are literally false.
Yeah, roads and jobs aren't actually snakes or jails.
Right. But we react to them differently. The last two, they kind of ring true metaphorically. Our minds automatically generate a sense of what a snake-like or jail-like job might be like. And a lazy System 2 might just go with that feeling instead of thinking about the actual meaning of the words.
Wow, so our brains automatically come up with all these related ideas, and we don't even notice we're substituting one for the other.
Exactly. And System 2, if it's not paying close attention, it just accepts whatever System 1 throws at it.
Okay, this is getting pretty deep. Now, what about our difficulty with statistics and randomness? It seems like we're wired to see patterns, even when things are random.
We are. System 1 is really good at finding causal connections, even when they're not there. If we hear that some condition is more common in a certain area, we want to know why. But sometimes, especially with small groups, it could just be random chance.
Like that example with the cancer clusters.
Exactly. We want a reason, but sometimes it's just statistics. And we also tend to see patterns even in random sequences. Like if you flip a coin 6 times and it lands heads, 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 tails, 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 we see that as less random than heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, even though any specific sequence is equally likely.
So even when things are random, we try to find a pattern or a reason.
Yeah.
Our brains don't like things to be just random.
Exactly. And that brings us to the anchoring effect. This is a powerful bias, and it often works unconsciously.
Anchoring. Refresh my memory. What's that about?
It's when we consider a specific number before we estimate something. And that number, the anchor, it pulls our estimate towards it, even if it has nothing to do with the real answer.
Like that experiment with the Wheel of Fortune, where people had to guess the number of African countries in the UN. The number they spun on the wheel, it influenced their guesses even though it was totally random.
Exactly. A spinning wheel shouldn't tell you anything about African countries, but it still affected their estimates. And even when we try to adjust away from the anger, we usually don't adjust enough.
So even irrelevant numbers can bias our judgments. That's crazy.
It is. Now, we talked about the availability heuristic earlier, but Kahneman comes back to it, and this time he connects it more directly to the interplay between System 1 and System 2.
So it's not just about ease of recall.
Right. It's more nuanced than that. System 1 tries to find examples, and if it can do that easily, it creates a feeling of ease. And System 2 might then interpret that ease as meaning the event is more likely.
So if System 1 finds examples quickly, System 2 might just go with that, without checking if it's a good reason to think the event is actually more common.
Exactly. And this ties into the Tom W. puzzle again. We get that description of Tom, and even if we know that a field like computer science doesn't have that many students, if Tom sounds like a computer scientist, we tend to ignore the base rates and say he's more likely to be in that field.
Because he fits the stereotype, we go with that, even if the numbers say something else.
Exactly. And while we can be reminded to pay attention to base rates, as soon as we get a vivid description, we tend to go right back to relying on representativeness.
Okay, now, the Linda problem. This one always gets me. It shows how our intuition about probability can be so weird.
The Linda problem, it's this. You get a description of Linda. She's outspoken, concerned with social justice, participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Then you're asked, which is more probable? A, Linda is a bank teller. Or B, Linda is a bank teller and active in the feminist movement.
So it's like, which one is she more likely to be?
Right. And logically, A has to be more likely because it includes all feminist bank tellers plus those who aren't. But most people choose B, the feminist bank teller.
Because it fits the description better.
Exactly. It feels more plausible even though it breaks the rules of probability. This is called the conjunction fallacy. What's interesting, if you make the comparison really clear, people are more likely to choose the right answer. It suggests that if we engage System 2, we can avoid this mistake.
So sometimes our intuition just goes with what sounds good, even if it's not logical.
Exactly. And that leads us to another important distinction: causal base rates versus statistical base rates.
Okay, what's the difference?
A statistical base rate is just a fact about a population, like the percentage of people in a certain job. But a causal base rate, it gives you a reason why someone might belong to a group. And we tend to ignore statistical base rates, but pay a lot of attention to causal ones.
So like in that cab problem with the unreliable witness.
Exactly. The percentage of green cabs versus blue cabs in the city, that's a statistical base rate. But if you also hear that drivers of one color cab are more reckless, that's a causal base rate, and it influences our judgment about which cab was involved in the accident.
And those causal base rates, they can make us more accurate, but they can also be dangerous, right? Like if they lead to stereotypes and discrimination.
You're right. It's a double-edged sword. We have to be careful. There's this experiment by Azen that shows the power of causal base rates really well. He told people about students taking an exam, and he gave them either a high or low pass rate for the class the students came from.
So he gave them a base rate, but he made it seem like it was about how hard the exam was, not just a random fact about the class.
Exactly. And people's judgments about how well the students did were totally influenced by that base rate. It's like we crave a reason, a causal explanation. And Kahneman points out that changing someone's mind just by giving them statistics, it's really hard.
We like stories better than numbers. Okay, let's talk about regression to the mean. This one seems to be consistently misunderstood.
It is. Regression to the mean, it's this statistical phenomenon where extreme scores tend to be followed by scores that are closer to the average. So if you do really well on something, you're likely to do a little worse next time, and if you do really poorly, you're likely to do a little better. And people often mistake this for the effects of praise or punishment.
Like that example with the flight instructor.
Exactly. The instructor thought praising good landings made pilots do worse, and criticizing bad landings made them do better. But it was probably just regression to the mean. Our performance is a mix of skill and luck, and extreme performances usually involve some luck, good or bad. That's not going to last.
So it's not that praise or criticism had a real effect. It's just that things tend to even out over time.
Right. And Kahneman talks about how when he was in the Israeli Defense Forces, they'd make predictions about officer candidates, and their predictions basically matched the distribution of final grades. It's like they had an intuitive understanding of the average, even if they weren't consciously using the idea of regression to the mean.
Okay, moving on to hindsight bias. This one is really relatable, that feeling of I knew it all along after something happens, even though we probably didn't.
Exactly. After something unexpected happens, we tend to adjust our memory to make it seem like the outcome was more predictable than it really was. Think about the success of Google. Now, it seems obvious, right?
Like it was destined to happen.
Right. But no one could have predicted that in the early days. There's so many things that could have happened, so many non-events. We tend to overestimate the role of skill and underestimate the role of luck.
So hindsight bias, it warps our memory to fit the present. And it can have real consequences, right?
Absolutely. Like after a surprising sports result, we might completely change our opinion of the teams, thinking we knew it all along. It stops us from learning from the unexpected.
Got it. Now, illusions of skill and validity, these are about being overconfident in our judgments, right?
Yes. We tend to overestimate our ability to predict things, especially in areas where prediction is really difficult. Like there's actually a pretty weak link between a company's long-term success and how good the CEO is perceived to be.
You'd think that would be a stronger connection.
You would, but it's not. And even when we intellectually know that certain methods, like unstructured job interviews, aren't very good at predicting performance, we still feel confident in our judgments based on them.
It's like we can't help but trust our gut, even when we know it might be wrong.
Right. And this is often made worse by professional culture, especially in fields like finance, where there's this belief in the ability of experts to consistently beat the market.
And we have all those pundits on TV making predictions and then explaining everything after it happens.
Exactly. It reinforces this idea that we can predict the future. But as Kahneman points out, it's not always the expert's fault. Some things are just fundamentally unpredictable.
So it's not always about being a bad expert. It's that the world itself can be unpredictable.
Right. Short-term trends, those can be predictable, but long-term forecasting in complex systems, that's notoriously hard. He talks about Meal's research, which showed that statistical algorithms often do a better job of predicting things than trained professionals, and this is across many fields, from grades to parole violations.
So sometimes a simple formula beats human judgment. That's kind of humbling.
It is. And algorithms are consistent, whereas human judgment, because of how System 1 works, it can be inconsistent. And often, a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation can be just as good or even better than expert judgment. Like the APGAR score for newborns, it's a simple algorithm that saved so many lives.
So algorithms can be powerful tools.
They can. And Kahneman even gives advice on how to use them to improve things like hiring decisions. By defining traits, asking structured questions, scoring each trait separately, and then sticking to the total score, you can get better results than with unstructured interviews.
So when is intuition actually likely to be a good thing, a sign of real expertise?
Two things are crucial: a predictable environment and lots of practice in that environment, with clear feedback so you can learn from your mistakes. Think of things like chess, experienced medical diagnosis, firefighting. In those fields, experts see similar situations over and over again, and their System 1 learns to recognize the important cues. But in areas where things are mostly unpredictable, like picking stocks or long-term political forecasting, intuition is much more likely to be an illusion.
Got it. So let's talk about the planning fallacy and our tendency to be overly optimistic. We tend to underestimate how long things will take, how much they'll cost, and how risky they are, and we overestimate the benefits.
Exactly, like that story Kahneman tells about planning a curriculum. They knew that similar projects usually took a long time and often failed, but they were still way too optimistic about their own plan. This optimistic bias, it's everywhere, and it can be really costly. Entrepreneurs, inventors, even CEOs, they often take on too much risk because they're too optimistic. Studies have shown a link between CEO optimism and bad decisions, like overpaying for acquisitions and mergers that don't work out.
So optimism can be a bad thing in those situations.
It can if it's not tempered with realism. Even financial professionals like CFOs, they're overconfident in their forecasts. It's like we focus on the best case scenario and ignore the lessons from the past.
Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about Bernoulli's error. This is about how traditional economics didn't really account for the importance of our starting point when we make decisions.
Right. Bernoulli's theory said that how we value wealth depends only on the final amount. But Kahneman pointed out that it's not that simple. Our reference point, where we're starting from, matters a lot. A gain of $1,000 feels different if you were expecting to gain $2,000 versus if you were expecting to stay at your current level.
So it's not just about the final amount, it's about the change relative to where we are now.
Exactly. That's a key insight. And that leads us to prospect theory, which is a more accurate model of how we actually make decisions when there's risk involved. Loss aversion is a central part of that.
Loss aversion. Tell us about that.
Loss aversion is this idea that losing something hurts more than gaining the same thing feels good. And this affects our choices in a big way. Like, think about someone who's unemployed and doesn't want to take a job that pays less than their old one, even though they really need the money.
The feeling of loss is stronger than the desire for the gain.
Exactly. Or Kahneman's example of those hedonic twins, Albert and Ben, who are hesitant to switch jobs even if the new one has something they value just as much as what they'd be giving up. We're just wired to avoid losses more than we want to get gains.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the way we handle probabilities in prospect theory? It sounds like we're not always rational about that either.
We're not. We don't treat probabilities in a straightforward way, especially when they're very small or very large. We tend to overweight small probabilities. That's the possibility effect. It's why people buy lottery tickets. That tiny chance of a huge win can feel much bigger than it really is. And we underweight probabilities that are almost certain, the certainty effect.
So we don't treat a 98% chance of winning as being that much different from a 100% guarantee.
Right. The psychological difference feels bigger than the actual 2% difference.
Yeah.
And there's a Lay's paradox, which shows how our preferences can actually violate the rules of expected utility theory.
It sounds like our brains play tricks on us with probabilities.
They do, especially at the extremes. And all of this leads to what's called the fourfold pattern of risk attitudes.
Okay, what's that?
It's how our willingness to take risks changes depending on the probability and whether it's a potential gain or loss. So for high probability gains and low probability losses, we're usually risk averse. We want the sure thing when it comes to gains, and we don't want to risk a big loss.
So we play it safe in those situations.
Right. But for low probability gains and high probability losses, we become risk seeking. That explains things like buying lottery tickets where there's a tiny chance of a huge win, and also things like gamblers doubling down when they're almost certain to lose.